After his early successes, Napoleon's name began to spread across France. People spoke of him as a young general who brought order to chaos. His greatest early triumph came during the Italian campaign. With a small and tired army, Napoleon moved quickly and struck his enemies before they were ready. Again and again, he won battles that others thought were impossible. Soldiers admired him because he shared their hardships. He marched with them, slept near them, and spoke to them directly. They felt that he understood them. To many, Napoleon was not just a commander. He was a leader who inspired loyalty and confidence. Back in France, the government was weak and unstable. The people were tired of endless conflict and uncertainty. Napoleon saw this and understood that France needed strong direction. Step by step, he moved closer to power. In 1799, he led a political takeover known as the coup of 18 Brumaire. Without much bloodshed, he became the most powerful man in the country. Now, Napoleon was no longer just a general. He was the first consul of France. He began to reform the nation. He fixed the economy, changed the legal system, and brought order where there had once been fear. Many people welcomed these changes because they brought stability to their daily lives. But power is never silent. As Napoleon grew stronger, his ambition grew with him. He no longer wanted only to serve France. He wanted to shape it, and perhaps even rule all of Europe. By 1804, Napoleon crowned himself emperor. He placed the crown on his own head, showing the world that he answered to no one but himself. France had a new ruler, and Europe watched in both fear and awe. In the next part, we will follow Napoleon into the great wars that made him a legend and slowly began to lead him toward his fall. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the island of Corsica in 1769, just 1 year after the island became part of France. His family was not rich, but they were proud and ambitious. From a very young age, Napoleon showed signs of being different from other children. He was quiet, serious, and deeply interested in books, especially those about history and war. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to France to study at a military school. Life there was not easy. He spoke with a strong accent and came from a poor background. So many of the other students made fun of him. But Napoleon did not give up. Instead, he spent more time studying than anyone else. While others played, he read about great generals and past empires. In his mind, he dreamed of one day becoming powerful and respected. As he grew older, Napoleon became especially skilled in mathematics and artillery. These skills would later help him on the battlefield. When he graduated, he joined the French army as a young officer. At that time, France was in chaos. The French Revolution had begun, and the old system of kings and nobles was collapsing. For Napoleon, this was not just a dangerous time, it was an opportunity. Because many older officers had fled or been executed, young and talented men could rise quickly. Napoleon did exactly that. He proved himself in battles and showed that he could think faster and plan better than most commanders. His calm mind and strong will made others trust him. Slowly, step by step, Napoleon began his climb. He was no longer just a poor boy from Corsica. He was becoming a name people would remember. But this was only the beginning of his long and complicated journey. In the next part, we will follow how Napoleon's early successes turned him into a national hero and how power started to change him. As emperor, Napoleon moved quickly to expand his influence across Europe. He believed that France should not only be strong, but dominant. One by one, he challenged the great powers of the time, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. His armies marched with confidence, and his strategies shocked the world. Napoleon was not the tallest man, but on the battlefield he seemed enormous. He could read the land, the weather, and the enemy's mind. His victories at Austerlitz and Jena showed his genius. Entire armies collapsed under his pressure. For a time, it felt as if nothing could stop him. Across Europe, kings fell and borders were redrawn. Napoleon placed his own family members on foreign thrones. His brothers became kings, his allies became rulers. France stood at the center of a new empire. At home, Many people admired him. He brought laws, roads, schools, and order. But war never sleeps. Every victory created new enemies. Nations that feared him began to unite against him. Still, Napoleon pushed forward. He believed his destiny was written in greatness. He trusted his mind more than anyone else's. And for a while, the world seemed to agree. But deep beneath the triumph, quiet cracks began to form. The empire was large, too large, and even the strongest man cannot control everything forever. In the next part, we will follow Napoleon into his most dangerous decision, the invasion that changed everything. In 1812, Napoleon made the most ambitious decision of his life. He gathered the largest army Europe had ever seen and marched toward Russia. More than 600,000 soldiers followed him across rivers, forests, and endless land. He believed that one great victory would force the Russian emperor to surrender. But Russia did not fight the way Napoleon expected. Instead of meeting him in one final battle, the Russian army slowly retreated, burning their own cities and fields behind them. They left nothing for Napoleon's men to eat or use. The French army moved deeper and deeper into empty land. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found a silent, burning city. There was no celebration, no surrender, only smoke and cold. Winter was coming. As the temperature dropped, hunger and sickness spread through the army. Horses died. Soldiers froze. Discipline collapsed. The long retreat began, and it was worse than the march in. Snow covered the roads. Enemies attacked from the shadows. Every step became a struggle for survival. From 600,000 men, only a small part returned. The rest were lost to cold, hunger, and war. The Russian campaign destroyed Napoleon's greatest strength, his army. For the first time, Europe saw that Napoleon could be beaten. His enemies gathered their courage. They were no longer afraid. The empire still stood, but it was wounded. In the next part, we will follow Napoleon as he faces defeat, exile, and the quiet end of his long journey. After months of silence on the island of Elba, Napoleon's mind never rested. He watched the sea and thought about France, about power, and about the people who once followed him. He knew that the new rulers were weak and that the country was again unhappy. In early 1815, Napoleon made a bold move. He escaped from Elba and sailed back to France with only a small group of loyal men. When he landed, soldiers were sent to stop him. But instead of fighting, they listened to him. Napoleon spoke calmly, reminding them of who he was and what he had once done for France. One by one, they joined him. As he marched toward Paris, his army grew without a single battle. The people welcomed him. The king fled, and Napoleon, once again, took power. This period became known as the 100 Days. For a short time, it felt like the past had returned. Napoleon worked day and night, trying to rebuild his army and his control. But Europe was watching. The great powers did not want him back. They prepared for war. Napoleon knew that he had to strike first. He marched north to face the enemy before they could fully unite. The tension grew. The world held its breath. Napoleon was back on the stage of history, but the shadows around him were longer than ever. In the next part, we will follow him into the battle that would decide everything. Napoleon moved quickly in the spring of 1815. He knew time was against him. The armies of Britain, Prussia, and their allies were gathering, and if they joined together, his chances would be gone. So he decided to strike before they were ready. He led his troops into Belgium, hoping to defeat the enemy armies one by one. At first, his plan worked. He won early battles and pushed his opponents back. For a moment, it seemed like the old Napoleon had returned, calm, confident, and sharp-minded. But war is never simple. The weather turned bad. Rain fell heavily, turning the roads and fields into thick mud. Cannons moved slowly. Soldiers grew tired. Small delays became big problems. Napoleon waited for the ground to dry before attacking the enemy's main position near a small village called Waterloo. Across from him stood the British army under the command of the Duke of Wellington. Both sides waited in silence, watching each other. Napoleon believed he could still win. He trusted his experience and his past victories. But his enemies had learned from him. They were careful, patient, and ready. As the morning sun rose over the muddy fields, the final test began. In the next part, we will enter the Battle of Waterloo itself, the clash that would decide Napoleon's fate. The morning of June 18, 1815, was cold and quiet. A thick mist lay over the fields near Waterloo. Napoleon stood with his army, watching the enemy lines in the distance. He waited for the ground to dry, so his cannons could move more easily. Every minute felt heavy. When the battle began, the sound of artillery broke the silence. Smoke filled the air. Soldiers marched forward, step by step, through mud and fire. Napoleon sent his men again and again toward the British positions. The fighting was fierce and unforgiving. At first, his attacks nearly broke through. The enemy lines bent, but did not fall. Wellington's troops held their ground, waiting for help from the Prussian army. As the day went on, Napoleon grew impatient. He sent in his strongest soldiers, the Imperial Guard. These men had never been defeated. They marched forward with pride and discipline. But this time, something went wrong. The enemy fire was too strong. The Guard slowed, stopped, and then turned back. For the first time in history, they retreated. When the rest of the army saw this, fear spread quickly. The French lines collapsed. What had begun as an attack turned into a desperate escape. Napoleon watched in silence as his empire fell in a single afternoon. In the next part, we will follow him through the final days after Waterloo, the road away from power and toward exile. After the defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon's world changed in a single night. The army that once followed him with loyalty was gone. The roads were filled with tired, silent soldiers returning home. Paris was no longer safe for him. Napoleon returned to the city and faced the truth. The government did not support him anymore. The people were exhausted by war. His power had vanished. Once again, he gave up his throne. This time, there would be no escape. Napoleon knew that Europe would never allow him to rule again. He thought about running away to America, about disappearing into a new life. But his enemies were watching every move. In the end, Napoleon chose to surrender to the British. He believed they would treat him with honor. He boarded a ship and left France forever. The sea was calm, but his mind was not. He stood on the deck and looked back at the fading coastline. Everything he had built was now behind him. Soon, he learned his fate. He would not be sent to Elba again. He would be taken far away, to a lonely island in the South Atlantic called St. Helena. The journey was long and quiet. Days passed with only the sound of the waves and the wind. Napoleon was no longer an emperor. He was a prisoner of history. In the next part, we will follow him into exile and into the silence of his final years. The island of St. Helena was small, rocky, and far from the world Napoleon once ruled. Surrounded by endless ocean, it felt more like a prison than a home. When Napoleon arrived, he understood that this time, there would be no return. He was given a house called Longwood. It was cold, damp, and uncomfortable. The air was heavy, and the weather often changed without warning. For a man who had lived in palaces, this was a hard fall. At first, Napoleon was angry and restless. He walked the same paths again and again, thinking about the past. He spoke often about battles, mistakes, and lost chances. He told his story to those around him, as if trying to keep his life alive through words. Slowly, time began to soften him. His body grew weaker, but his mind remained sharp. He spent long hours reading, writing, and remembering. The man who once decided the fate of nations now decided only how to pass his quiet days. The guards watched him, but they also listened. They saw not just an emperor, but a human being, proud, lonely, and full of memories. Napoleon began to understand that his war was over, not just on the battlefield, but inside himself. The ocean outside his window never changed. It moved in slow, endless waves. And so did time. In the next part, we will listen to Napoleon's final thoughts, the words of a man looking back on everything he had been. As the years passed on St. Helena, Napoleon's world became very small. The ocean, the sky, and the quiet rooms of Longwood were all he saw. But inside his mind, the past was always alive. He spoke often about his early days, about Corsica, and about the dreams he once carried as a young man. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he grew silent. His voice was calm, but full of thought. Napoleon did not see himself only as a conqueror. He believed he had brought order where there was chaos, laws where there was confusion. He thought about what he had built and what he had lost. At night, he would sit near the window and listen to the wind. The sound of the sea reminded him of distance, distance from France, from power, from the life he once lived. His health slowly began to fail. He grew tired easily. Walking became harder, but his mind stayed awake, even when his body could not move much. He knew that his story was ending, not with noise or glory, but with quiet. And in that quiet, he found something close to peace. In the next part, we will follow Napoleon through his final days and the end of his long journey. Napoleon's health grew weaker with each passing month on St. Helena. The strong body that once rode across battlefields now struggled with simple movements. His steps became slow and his breath heavy. Still, his eyes remained sharp, full of memory and quiet fire. He spent more time in bed, listening to the wind outside his window. The ocean never stopped speaking. Its sound filled the long hours of the day and night. Sometimes Napoleon would close his eyes and imagine himself back in France, walking through familiar streets, hearing the voices of the people. Those around him noticed the change. The man who once commanded armies now needed help to stand. But he never complained. He accepted his weakness with the same calm he once faced his enemies. In his final days, Napoleon spoke softly about his life. He remembered his victories, his mistakes, and the faces of those he had loved and lost. He did not sound angry anymore, only thoughtful. On May 5th, 1821, as the rain fell gently on St. Helena, Napoleon Bonaparte died. There was no crowd, no music, no flags, only silence. The story of the man who changed Europe ended far from home, on a lonely island, with the sound of the sea as his final companion. And so, history closed one of its greatest chapters, not with thunder, but with a quiet breath. After Napoleon's death, the world did not forget him. In France, people spoke his name with mixed feelings, some with pride, some with fear, some with sadness. He was no longer a ruler, but a memory, and memories can be powerful. Books were written about him. Songs were sung. Painters tried to capture his face. Soldiers told stories of his courage and his cold focus in battle. Even his enemies respected the force of his mind. Years passed, and France slowly changed. New kings came and went. Governments rose and fell. But Napoleon's shadow remained. People still argued about who he really was: a hero, a tyrant, a genius, or a dreamer. In quiet homes, old men told young boys about the emperor who once made all of Europe tremble. In schools, children learned his name before many others. His life became part of the soul of France. Napoleon himself was gone, but the idea of Napoleon lived on. His story was no longer about war alone. It was about ambition, rise, fall, and the cost of greatness. It was about how far a human being can go and what he must lose along the way. In the next part, we will explore how the world slowly turned Napoleon from a man into a legend. After Napoleon's death, his story did not end. It changed shape. He was no longer only a man who once ruled and fell. He slowly became an idea, a symbol that people carried in their minds. Time began to soften the pain of his wars and sharpen the beauty of his rise. In France, people were tired of broken promises and endless change. They looked back and searched for meaning. In that search, Napoleon stood tall, not because he was perfect, but because his life showed how far a human being could go with discipline, intelligence, and belief. Writers wrote about his youth. Painters showed him strong and calm. Songs spoke his name with pride. Even those who had suffered under his rule felt the power of his story. He had lived fast, burned bright, and disappeared into silence. Napoleon was no longer judged only by what he did. He was remembered for what he represented: ambition, courage, destiny. The man had died, but the legend had just begun. Even as years passed, Napoleon's presence never fully left Europe. His name stayed in the air, like an echo that refused to fade. Long after the cannons were silent, people still spoke of him in classrooms, cafes, and quiet homes. He had become part of the way the world explained power, ambition, and change. In France, leaders rose and fell, but each one was compared to Napoleon. Some tried to copy his strength. Others feared his example. He was the measure of greatness, and also the warning of excess. His life became a mirror. Everyone who looked into it saw something different. Across Europe, his shadow moved through memory. In Germany, people remembered both destruction and reform. In Italy, they remembered new ideas and lost independence. In Britain, he was still the great rival, the storm that almost crossed the sea. Napoleon had changed not only borders, but thinking. He showed that one person, with enough will and vision, could bend the course of history. But he also showed the price of that power. Slowly, his story stopped being only about him. It became about all humans who dream too high, climb too fast, and fall too hard. In the next and final part, we will close the story not with war or exile, but with meaning. Napoleon Bonaparte's story is not only about battles, crowns, and empires. It is about a human being who believed deeply in his own destiny. He was born with nothing but ambition, and he carried that ambition across continents. He rose higher than almost anyone in history, and he fell just as far. What makes his life powerful is not only what he achieved, but what he teaches. Napoleon shows us that intelligence, discipline, and courage can change the world. But he also shows us that power has a cost. Every victory creates enemies. Every dream demands sacrifice. He was a man who shaped history, but history also shaped him. His successes lifted him into legend, and his failures pulled him back into silence. In the end, he did not die as an emperor surrounded by glory. He died as a man, alone, listening to the ocean. And maybe that is the most important lesson. No matter how far a person rises, they are still human. No matter how loudly the world remembers them, they still return to quiet. Napoleon's life moves from noise to silence, from fire to stillness. And in that stillness, his story becomes clear. It is not about conquering the world. It is about understanding the limits of power and the meaning of being human. And so, the story ends, not with a battle, but with a breath.